Sorry about that, everyone. Tammy was having some problems with her connection, so I've taken over the recording. So hopefully that will stop the on and off, what have you. So, all right. Anyway, back to it.
Thanks, Tony. All right, so that's time. So again, I'm not asking anybody to share. It's really more about reflecting on the thinking process. But what we did here was some thinking like a historian, and we can play within this space without having any specific history content right away. So we can invite students to think about a timeline of events, a sequence of events in something that they have a context for. I'm a big fan of kids having models of their own writing or of their own work to use as a framework, because you can take a student's timeline that they curated and you can put it up against a timeline that a historian has created. And you can recognize that historians make arguments through their timelines. They choose specific events and prioritize specific things because they're making a case for something that they're arguing for. And you start to notice it when you really understand how a timeline might be crafted. And so this is kind of playing in this space of continuity and context within the history standards space, but it doesn't require students to have content specifically. But then when you take the step to, hey, I'm going to ask you to write a sequence of events, to craft a timeline of some sort, to do some work with periodization, depending on what your age and stage is here that you're working with, you can kind of play with this. What I've done in as well with kids and in some workshop spaces, but didn't have time for it in our space today, is I've used the book Courage by Bernard Weber. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it. It's a great book. And asked kids to curate their courage timeline. So they write a timeline of their life, you read them the book Courage, and then you ask them to curate by adding or crafting their reframing their timeline through the lens of what were your most courageous moments. Often that's a fun thing to do in the first weeks of school, to talk about the transition to another grade and the new things that they're going to do and the courage that it takes to start something new, like a new school year. So that's a way to invite kids in to play with this skill, and acknowledging that thinking like a historian doesn't always have to be about reading a source either. It can be thinking about the decision making that historians make. And when we read something that someone who is telling the story of history, someone has created, where they're coming from and what types of choices they have when they're doing their work. And that helps us to be critical thinkers when we're engaging with some of our sources. All right. So any thoughts or reflections on that as far as the playing in this dimension 2 space and what it looks like for students?
I just want to thank you. I think it was such an interesting activity, and I loved the example that you shared about doing so through the lens of courage. And what a beautiful picture book that is.
It is. And I'm sure people can imagine all different books that could anchor, right? Any kind of concept or theme that you would like to emphasize, students can do it. I'm just always very careful that I do not ask students to share their timelines unless they want to share their timelines. So I keep this very, and adults too, right? Keep it very like whatever you want to share about your life is for your writing journal. But it does help to anchor kids in, this is the work that historians do, and you just did it, and then you're going to maybe do it when you have some content in class, and then they have a model of their own writing to refer back to.
Lauren, I have to say you read my mind. I was actually thinking the other day about having students writing obituaries, but not making it as morbid. And I couldn't think of how to do it. So you've actually answered my question inadvertently. So get out of my head. And thank you.
We've spent a lot of time together. So it makes sense for sure. All right. Well, I like for people to have useful tools and things that they can bring to the classroom. If you use it, let me know how you use it. And again, very much like our inquiry process, it's iterative. People put things into different versions and make them work in their classroom for their kids. And it's always interesting to me. A lot of my staff uses this in Westport, and they've done all different kinds of iterations of this activity, depending on the group of students they have and the content that they're working with. All right, so that's a little bit of play in Dimension 2. Any final thoughts?
I just wrote in the chat that this was great, and I'm wondering over the course of the day whether you'll have other examples of playing in the areas of geography, civics, and or economics.
That's one of my future goals. I think you're going to see some examples of different activities and classroom-based practice throughout instructional design components throughout the day. But it's a little bit of a goal for me to kind of start to develop a better suite of activities that are tasks where you're playing within these dimensions to give teachers some tasks to work and rework and play with a little bit.
Tracy, as I'm looking at this, though, you could change for students, you could change this to places they've been versus events in their life to hit a geography standard and have them map it, or something along those lines. Like, you could take the structure of this and it would work quite well, I think, with some of the other elements of the social studies.
Yeah, and you can overlay this too with like, what are the most significant economic policy, right? You're teaching an economics focus. What are some significant economic policies, right, that have shaped your, in your lifetime, or, or that have shaped your life, right? So you can go back to that too. So there's tons of ways timelines are fun. You can really play with timelines in some really exciting ways with students. And the other thing is that they're not a heavy lift with writing either. And so a lot of students who really struggle with accessing text and digging into sources and are working to strengthen their writing skills or just their stamina for writing, timelining can be a really interesting tool for them to really feel some success with being able to rank and prioritize and sort and curate. And it's just a way into critical thinking. And I think sometimes we look at it as like, well, it's just a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's just a list of things, but you can do some really heavy lifting with critical thinking when you're doing timelining. And it's one of my most fun ways to play within Dimension 2.
One example actually of timelines that I do in my class is an assignment I call the role model assignment, in which actually students find someone that they believe is their role model, and then they develop a timeline about that person, and we introduce other aspects of history in it, or historical thinking, such as, for instance, sharing their pictures, sharing like some excerpts from an audio that they record with them, they do an interview with them. So then you're expanding on the timeline also to include other interactive activities that engage students in the process of actually historical thinking. So these are other examples. As we go through the presentation, I'm gonna actually look for other things that I've done in terms of geography, civics, and I will just, periodically share them with you.
Okay, so we're gonna move on. We're gonna play in Dimension 3 now. I don't know how many of you are familiar. There's a website. It's called Which One Doesn't Belong, and it has a bunch of these different graphics that you can use. You can make your own. They're easy enough to make. But Dimension 3 is really about what are the skills that kids need to be able to analyze information and work towards drawing some conclusions in an inquiry, whatever that may be, however they might decide to communicate those or whatever action they might take. What are the skills that they need to gather information, to evaluate sources, and to begin to develop claims and use evidence for those claims? And again, this is an example of kind of a way into doing that without necessarily having to have a ton of background knowledge but we can practice what the thinking skill looks and feels like. All right, so this is kind of the game, which one doesn't belong. So you can, it's probably better to do this in the chat. I think you can probably enter this in the chat and it'll be fun to watch how it comes up in the chat. So you're gonna take a look, you see 4 quadrants, right? They all have things in the 4 quadrants. And you need to tell me which one of the 4 quadrants doesn't belong. So you're going to make an argument based on the evidence that's in front of you to say which one of the quadrants doesn't belong out of the 4. All right, so take a couple minutes, and when you're ready, you can put which one you think doesn't belong in the chat. All right, so if you're looking at the chat, you can see there's no right answer here. Right? This is about looking at the information that is in front of you, drawing on some of your background knowledge that you have about coins, and also looking at patterns. Some people applied a little bit of a mathematics spin. Some folks were looking at heads or tails. Did I see any other ones? Heads or tails is the big one, right? How much it adds up to, all of that. And kids will do this. I did this with my social studies team, but I used 4 quadrants with different news sources, and my meeting devolved into, the arguments were all over the place. And it was just really fascinating to see. So you can play in this space. One of the fun things about this is that this can also help to show what that iterative process looks like. So when you start to wonder about these coins, you might actually have some questions that you can take a look at the United States Mint. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this. I'll see if can everybody see this here? So the Mint actually has a coin classroom that I found. And it tells you a little bit about the history, about the US Mint, and you can go and learn a little bit about what the US Mint does. And of course, there's a lot of history, and there's some economics, and there's location, so there's geography. I'll leave it to you, but you can see on here the very coins that you were just looking at are right there as circulating coins on the US Mint page. So I'll pop that into the chat for you to look at, because this is one of those things where you can practice some iterations, because students can say, I think this one doesn't belong, I think that one doesn't belong, without really having a ton of background knowledge. I know a lot of our stuff is electronic, so I don't know how much changed, but I think schools are still doing a lot with collecting coins. And I mean, my kids like to find coins and save them and all of that. But you could do a little research and then make an argument about which one doesn't belong based on what you might have learned about the quarter, or what you might have learned about the history of the dime, and things like that. And you can make a much more unique and nuanced argument once you've taken a look at some of the resources that are on the US Mint website. And I'll put these websites into the chat so that everyone has access. But using this 4 quadrant approach can really help with kind of allowing kids to play within this space, craft some arguments, do some evaluation, and also challenge each other. So you could put them in groups and have them talk about this, right? I'm going to think on my own which one I don't think doesn't belong, and then I'm going to hear my classmates talk about what they think doesn't belong, and I'm going to understand really the nuance of argument, right? That how argument can function and how it works, and then I can build my knowledge. If I learn more about coins, I might have a better understanding or be able to make an interesting or unique argument about coins based on what I've learned. Okay, so that's an example of playing in Dimension 3. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions on that? Is everyone?
Yeah, so I will ask one. So just to be clear, this would be live in Dimension 3 when you get to when you add on the idea of doing a little bit of research to make a more nuanced argument, right? Like if you just did the which one doesn't belong based on looking, but not adding the research, that wouldn't quite rise up to living in dimension 3. Yeah.
Right. So the whole idea is to practice, right? So you can do which one doesn't belong as a warm-up activity, right? It can be part of your instructional design. And you are getting to some of the thinking, right? Like when we're talking about arguments, you are giving students some practice with the type of thinking that we need to do. So I always try to think about like, what's a task that we can do that type of thinking that is actually a heavy lift, but kids don't realize how much of a heavy lift it is. And then how can we add some complexity to that once they're hooked and they say, wait a minute, you know, I really thought that it was the top left quadrant. I mean, if you've been, for example, like I taught middle school for a very long time, there are kids who would have left the room arguing about these coins, right? Like it would have stuck with them. So those are moments where you kind of bring that natural curiosity in and say, okay, let's go digging and find some sources that will help us to strengthen our argument for one, or change our mind, right? Or craft a nuanced argument about these 4 pieces. But yes, dimension 3 is about incorporating information, gathering and evaluating sources. But it's also up against this piece of supporting an argument, right? So giving kids that practice of what does it mean? How do you consider an argument and reevaluate your thinking in the process of that? Which one doesn't belong is a great way to kind of capture what that thinking really is in a low stakes type of approach. Any other questions about this? I don't know about you, but when I first did this, I started to fall into like the black hole of which one doesn't belong, and wanted to just went into that website and was just pulling different things.
Lauren, this may be useful for others on the call, but the British Museum has a very, very well-respected coin collection, and they do a lot of educational programming, and they do an activity that could be an extension of something like this, which is essentially you can bring in the sciences and an inquiry level, and you can use taxonomy. So you can actually use classification language and classification terms to try to classify the coins as well. So if you wanted to make it incredibly concrete and scientific, you could take that same kind of idea and then pair it with an interdepartmental activity too, or all sorts of stuff like that. But if you're into coins, it's a great resource, that British Museum website.
And I know a lot of elementary classrooms, right, do a lot with, you're doing work with counting, a lot of hands-on. You could do station work with this. This is an opportunity for some integration with math as well, to think about it as far as station work, center work for elementary students, where you could embed social studies concepts and mathematics as well.
Can I take 5 minutes to just share some examples of inquiry? So just some examples of activities that you can use with inquiry. One of them is using photographs. You're going to find a lot of photographs actually on teachitct.org. And as you can see in this example, there's the dimension 1 is the inquiry question. It's actually written in the teachitct website. So here, for instance, for this example, in what ways have the lives of children in Connecticut changed or stayed the same over time? The supporting question here would be, how would my life have been different if I grew up in Connecticut 100 years ago? What can pictures from that time, from 100 years, tell us about the past? And of course, this picture is selected from the teachitct.org, and it represents actually children sitting in a classroom like 100 years ago, children who lived in Connecticut, right? So dimension 2 here would be really trying to analyze this picture and as a historical source, like as a primary source. And the dimension 3 would be analyzing it and what do students see in this picture. They try to analyze or take apart each aspect of the picture. And this is like a whole new different workshop, by the way. It's just going over examples like really quick, okay? Dimension 4 in which they communicate conclusions. So they will create a double bubble or Venn diagram comparing their lives today with the lives of children 100 years ago. This is just one example. Another example for geography is if you have a map of Connecticut, and let's say the students, for instance, if you can ask the students, this is for 4th grade, and I called this unit, Are We There Yet? So you can show them the map and ask them questions like, where is the state of Connecticut on the map? Which states surround Connecticut? This is not, so they will locate Connecticut. They will look for the states around Connecticut and how long would it take to travel from Connecticut to Oregon, right? So then they would count how many states. They maybe would look up information for investigation, for inquiry. They would look up like how many miles are between, Connecticut and Oregon, right? Can I take Route 66? Now they will have to look at another map to actually, or do like a search, right? To find out if Route 66 goes through, connects Connecticut to Oregon. You know what I'm saying? So you can play with the idea of inquiry and geography. Another example I use in my class for 1st grade, actually, the legend of John Henry, and this introduces like diversity and diverse narratives. And so there's a song here that talks about John Henry. It describes his story. I don't know that we have enough time to play the song, but when students listen to the song, and then they can create their own compelling questions, or the teacher can pause a compelling question. Some of the compelling questions, for instance, which parts of the story of John Henry are real and which parts might not be real? And in that sense, maybe students can do like an initial hypothesis, and then they can do an investigation after that and try to verify the information. And why is John Henry's story so important? That's another question. That's a compelling question because it doesn't have a specific answer. Okay, so these questions serve as a starting point for an inquiry and capitalize on the interest young children have in distinguishing between real things and fake. Okay. Here is an activity that I do for civic responsibility in elementary grades. I try to have students point out the wrong answers, between how can I be responsible for my family and myself, and how can I be responsible for my community and country? And then I read each statement and the students say yes, no, right? So I'm responsible for my actions. Yes, I ride my bike to school. I'm not sure that this would count as a civic responsibility, really. It's a choice, right? But maybe if in a place where actually there are no cars and, it's designated for bike riding, maybe I shouldn't walk or drive my car, right? So in that sense, it would be like a civic statement. You know what I'm saying? So you can play with it and you can be creative. Another activity actually that I did for my class was I took the students for a field trip to the state capitol. And there they gave them a chart that says how does actually an idea become a law? So after the visit, I took my students in the classroom, and then we tried to replicate this this process through role play. So for instance, some students became like the governor, some students became like the Senate, some students became like the lobbyists. So you can have students enact a process, and and then they will find out and know or apply how this process works, to understand like how does government works, or what are the branches of government. Okay, so there are endless instructional strategies for all social studies content areas, and this was just a 5-minute overview of what you can do in the class with social studies and inquiry. I hope that was helpful.
So Rhonda, I have to leave at 10:30, but I did want to go over a couple little things. If we could just fast forward, it's just one slide. And for the sake of time, I also don't want to keep anybody too late for the sake of the schedule too. I first of all, I wanted to plug the Teach It template, which you guys are all going to be looking at later on, but in case anybody's not around for Rebecca's session, I did link here, and I'll throw the link. I think Rebecca actually, who's on the call, did throw it into the chat, to the Teach It template, the blank template, which is like a really nice dipping your toe in the water example of what a good inquiry lesson can look like. And of course, Teach It focuses a lot on obviously Connecticut history, exclusively on Connecticut history. But what I wanted to do really quickly with everybody is a little bit, just as like a check-in before we head on to our next session, a little bit of like a backwards design situation. And so I'm going to throw in the chat, and you might all, some of you, be familiar with the state of New York has a website full of great inquiry resources. Again, they're more in tune with some of the New York examples of history and social studies content, but they're aligned with the C3, and they're really, really, really effective inquiry tools. In the spirit of the news cycle this week, I've linked in the chat, if you could all open to what should show up as the C3 New York teachers example for a lesson on women's rights. And yeah, there it is. It's right above Rebecca Fuhrer. So if you could open that. And what I want everybody to do is I just want everybody to take 2 or 3 minutes. We'll take 3. And either write down or try to file in your head some of the elements of inquiry that are present, or all of the elements of inquiry that are present in this particular lesson that has been done by the New York system. And then as you go, please write in the chat some of the essential elements of an inquiry design model that you think work effectively in this particular lesson. So just take 2 or 3 minutes, throw that stuff in the chat. I just want to have a little discussion about some of the things that work and maybe don't work. Okay, so it's been 2 minutes and I appreciate everybody who made a comment in the chat. So I'd kind of throw to the group. Now, Tracy, you said supporting questions that help students answer the compelling question, which is great. Also, it implies that there is a compelling question, right, to structure the unit, which is something that we've discussed is sort of essential to an inquiry activity. Aaron, what about, I'd be curious if you're okay with speaking, what do you mean by like a rich and provocative, compelling question? What about it is rich and provocative?
Sure. So I'm thinking about how, I know this says 7th grade, but I'm thinking about the intersections with students' understanding of justice and injustice, and often their motivation to explore those issues together of fairness and unfairness. And then as I looked at the formative tasks, I really appreciated the ways in which those were constructed so that students are engaging with historical sources, but there's always a connection to relevant and relevance of today. And so in that way, I think that the question is all the more compelling because it's designed in such a way that the students are asked to apply to their contemporary contexts.
Yeah, the making connections component is super strong here. And it's not essential to do it right with every compelling question, but it can be super meaningful for a lot of these units. What does everybody think about the source material that was used here? Did anybody explore the evidence piece?
So I was just writing in the chat that, some key sources are provided, right? And so that is, I don't know if different is the right word, but, dimension 2 here implies that students are going to find resources. So this goes to Lauren's point about curriculum design versus instructional design, right? So as part of the curriculum design, there are these key sources, I think mostly primary sources, if not all, are provided. So I'm just sort of curious about the relationship between sources that are provided and then students finding sources, but certainly having some key sources that students can interpret seems like an important piece of curriculum design, so that teachers are supported in being able to focus on instructional design. So I don't know if anybody wants to speak to that, but just some thoughts.
I mean, speaking as a high school person, Tracy, like having that vertical alignment of not just the inquiry model being kind of embedded throughout the process. So when I say teach a 10th grader, they kind of have an understanding of what I'm asking them to do. They can kind of hit the ground running is really key. And I think that that's probably one of the most important components of curriculum design, but also that digital literacy component as well, being able to like have students who know how, like if you were to ask them, go find a source without just giving them a list that you established in advance, because I have a bias. As much as I don't want to admit that I have a bias, right? I do, and it's going to show in the sources I choose. As much as I try to make sure it doesn't, that students, that's embedded, right? Not just the inquiry component, but how do you source that material, and how can students do that independently or be able to work in a group setting where they can manage themselves to be able to source that material. And I don't know, like if anybody's writing curriculum, if they have any strategies for how to incorporate that effectively, vertically through, the K-12 experience.
I would also say that, particularly starting in really 7th, 8th grade, and the middle grades, the use of annotated bibliography, and it can start with very small baby steps of what that looks like. Actually, the National History Day program has a great structure for that and resources on it that my teachers use, because we use a lot of National History Day resources and participate in that program. But having kids annotate their sources. So sometimes we are giving them a curated list of sources because that's what we have to do, or we're excerpting sources because we're pulling from sources that are far too much for a student to try to read through the whole thing, right? So we're pulling excerpts and trying to create those resource lists for kids to make sure that they have access to what they need to pursue the inquiry. And then there's this separate component of, if I'm going to go out and find some sources, what does that look like, and what are the processes for that, to Allison's kind of digital literacy point. But I do think the annotation, even in its like baby steps, I chose this source, or I thought this source would be helpful, the sentence starter type of approach can be really helpful no matter what format you're working in, whether it's students going to library databases and finding things themselves, or students working from a curated list. I think that's really, we want to hone in on that skill, and we can do that with annotated bibliographies pretty well.
I put the National History Day resource in the chat if anybody is interested. It is a really good one. Thanks, Lauren.
Yeah, you don't have to make it up on your own. They've kind of refined that over the years, and it is a really reasonable tool. And for K-5 folks, you can use that to kind of create some sentence starters for kids. And just make kind of really short sentence starters about, I chose this source because this source was helpful because, and that works for our younger learners.
One person mentioned in the chat, Robin, you mentioned in the chat about having the summative assessment. I'd be curious what people thought about the summative assessment that was embedded into this particular lesson. Rhonda's smiling. She knows what I'm asking.
I like your question. This is a very smart, to the point question. Thank you.
So I know for me, what I like about them is that it allows the students to take the skills of the standards and apply them with the content. So you're seeing them take everything and kind of braid it all together and show their understanding. So here they're having to pose their arguments, using their understanding, justifying, pulling from the different supporting questions and compelling questions, where it's bringing it back to that big compelling question that they've been working at.
Yeah, I agree. And I would argue that the one thing that maybe could make it into a stronger summative assessment is what Lauren suggested, which is attach an annotated bibliography and have them do additional research. Right, to not only strengthen their research skills, but to also strengthen their arguments and to strengthen their connection back to that compelling question.
I would also say that when we look at assessment, and I could go on about this for too long, but we're running short on time. When we're talking about assessment within the context of inquiry, we have to try to frame things, and you're going to see things in documents around, right? A summative assessment, a performance task, whatever it may be, and how that's designed within the context of a progression of learning. But we have to think about summative evidence. A lot of times we're gathering evidence of students learning and students' mastery of specific inquiry skills in process. And so we do have to think about that within the context of assessment. How do we as educators gather evidence of students learning and their deep thinking in the process of inquiry, right? That final summative task is critical, and we want to see all those pieces come together. But it's also really helpful when we think diagnostically about kids. It's sometimes hard at the end when we see certain pieces that have fallen apart within that process. And it's really helpful to tune in as students practice those skills. So for example, some of those little tasks that seem, very manageable and silly in some ways, where we're going to play within the discipline with something with coins and make arguments, those are also critical assessment moments to think about which students are struggling with this and how can I start to teach into some of these types of thinking and help kids to build their skills so that they can see success as they progress through the inquiry. And so some of that gathering of assessment evidence takes place throughout the entire process as well. So I just wanted to kind of.
Yeah, Lauren, I agree. I don't think people should confuse a formative or a series of formatives with a check-in or a series of check-ins, that they're not the same thing. And that might be one of the weak spots of a lesson like this, which is also a couple years old. Inquiry has obviously evolved since these were done a few years back. So thanks. I think I speak for all of us when I say if you need any resources, any of the stuff that we've provided you today, any ideas, rubrics, whatever, that you could reach out to any of us at any time. I don't know if we were helpful enough that you'd actually want to reach out to us, but we are here with obviously nothing to do. So please reach out.
And we will, Allison, with your permission, make the PowerPoint today available to participants.
Okay, can we ask you to kindly please fill out like 3-question form for us so that we know what we're doing right, what we need to work on, and what questions you have?
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Lauren,
Thank you.
Rhonda, Allison, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And how about if we take, let's take 2 minutes and then we'll do our next session. Okay, so 2 minutes and we're up for our next one.